Okay, if you're not familiar with the Zoom, there is a raise hand function in which we will address any technical issues that we have to our best, or to the best of our abilities. And you can also post the questions in the Q&A section. All right, they will be again answered at the end of the session after both speakers have spoken. Right, the overview for today's session, I will begin with a short introduction about the Economic Society of Singapore. Thereafter, we have Dr. Kwan Ming Leong to talk about an overview of the Economist Service of Singapore. Dr. Kwan Ming Leong is the Principal Economist of the Ministry of Trade and Industry. And today, we are also very delighted to have two speakers with us, Dr. Andy Feng, Principal Economist of the Ministry of Trade and Industry, to speak on Singapore's enterprise landscape, following which we have Assistant Professor Jungho from the School of Economics, Singapore Management University, to talk about startup firms and the workplace environment. We will have about 20 minutes of Q&A at the end of the session. Okay, just a short introduction about the Economic Society of Singapore. If you have not heard of our society, you can find out more information at ess.org.sg. We are a non-profit organization comprising economists, professionals, academicians, and policymakers, all with a common interest in economics. Our society is one of the oldest ones in Singapore, established in 1956, and the primary objective is to raise public awareness and stimulate public interest and debate on all economic issues. In the past, the society has participated in providing many important inputs for government initiatives, including the Forward Future Economy White Paper on Population, the Economic Strategies Committee, the CPF Policy Changes Study, Policy Options for the Singapore Economy. We also provide platform for discussions, including our yearly post-budget forum on the Singapore government budget. And we are usually the first to discuss the comments on the budget. Right. So as a young professional wing, of which I'm a member of, we are newly set up a branch to target the younger economists, which includes undergrads, fresh grads, and all aspiring economists under the age of 35. But of course, if you're above 35, we are not stopping you from joining our activities, right? We always welcome all perspectives. All right. Now I hand the time over to Dr. Kwan Ming Leong to provide an overview of the Economist Service. Dr. Kwan, please.
Thank you very much, CS Young. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to one and all. My name is Ming Leong. I'm an economist with the Singapore government's Economist Service. First of all, I'd like to thank the Economic Society of Singapore young professionals for this wonderful opportunity to organize the Applied Policy Economics Speaker Series. The idea of a speaker series arose after the publication of the Singapore government's Economist Service 20th anniversary book late last year in December 2021. Titled Economics in Practice, Evidence-Based Policy Making in Singapore, the book described the application of economics in public policy across a diverse range of economic and non-economic policy domains. In today's session, you will hear Andy share more about his chapter in the book on Singapore's enterprise landscape. While in subsequent talks, we will be able to hear more from speakers talking about land transport, as well as other areas such as healthcare, productivity and innovation, and environment. The book is available from World Scientific's website or at Books Kinokuniya. If you're interested in purchasing the book from World Scientific's website, there is a 20% discount code at the bottom left of the screen, WSE20. This is available for participants of the talk. As highlighted previously, the Economist Service is celebrating its 20th anniversary last year. So first established in 2001, the Economist Service is the premier service for economists in the Singapore public sector. Currently, we have a community of close to 100 economists, and we are deployed across more than 20 ministries and agencies that you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen. One very interesting thing is that although economists are deployed to different ministries and agencies, they have the opportunity to be rotated to other ministries and agencies over the course of their career. This is important because we place quite a lot of emphasis on the development of our public sector economists, including the diversification of their knowledge, the broadening of their skill sets. Broadly, our economists in the Economist Service shape public policies through three areas: surveillance and forecasting, economic research, and policy analysis. If you're interested to find out more about what Economist Service officers do, I highly encourage you to pick up a copy of the 20th anniversary book. It gives a lot of illustrations of the type of projects and studies our economists participate in. There are many different opportunities for economists there are many different opportunities in the Economist Service. So first, if you're interested in a career as a public sector economist, I will highly encourage you to apply to the Economist Service to join us. Second, we also offer Economist Service scholarships to students in JC and university. So for scholarship recipients, you will be allowed to join reputable or reputable local and overseas universities, and you'll be paid your full university fees as well as allowances. Third, we also offer internship programs under the Economist Service Research Assistant Program, where you have the opportunity to work with our public sector economists to undertake empirical research projects in the Economist Service. More information about the Economist Service can be found at the web link at the bottom. And if you have any further questions, you can email us at mti_es@mti.gov.sg. And I know that many of you have joined this session to hear more about enterprises. So without further ado, I'll hand you back to Siet Siong, who will be bringing us to the next segment of today's proceedings. Siet Siong, please.
Okay, thank you, Ming Leong. Right. So for the first speaker for today, we have Dr. Andy Feng. So allow me to quickly introduce Dr. Andy Feng. He is a principal economist in the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and he leads macroeconomic research and analysis and drives evidence-based policy evaluation. He has previously worked with the Economic Development Board and at the Center for Economic Performance in the United Kingdom. Dr. Feng received his MPhil in econometrics from Cambridge University and a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics. His research interests includes public economics, industrial organization, and labor economics. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Andy Feng to start his session on an overview of Singapore's enterprise landscape.
Thanks, Shane. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'll need to trouble Shane to help me load the slides. And while he does, welcome to this talk on this cold and wet afternoon. I hope you are somewhere nice and warm. I think the one benefit of having virtual sessions like this is everyone can hopefully be somewhere comfortable. And I want to thank Shane again and the team for organizing this speaker series and for inviting me to speak. Ming Leong mentioned our book, Economics in Practice, which I encourage you to beg, borrow, or buy. So don't steal it, but buy it. And there's a chapter in this book about enterprises, and that's what I'll be speaking about today. So this chapter is a review of various studies and research that public sector economists have undertaken on the enterprise landscape in Singapore. So let me acknowledge their contributions. Next slide, please. I'll organize my presentation into three parts. So first, I'll show you how dynamic the enterprise landscape is. Then I'll describe the impact of some government schemes. And finally, I'll touch on some early research on the COVID-19 measures. Next slide. So to begin, what are enterprises? I think if you ask economists, the simplest starting point is to imagine an enterprise as a black box that simply takes inputs such as labor or capital, and it transforms these inputs into output such as computers or services. So this makes it sound like enterprises are really boring and uniformly the same. Next slide, please. So, of course, reality is more interesting than that, and enterprises come in different forms and sizes. So, this slide gives an overview of the landscape in Singapore, and it is anything but boring and uniform. So, let me run you through some of these numbers. There are around 281,000 enterprises, and the vast majority, 99%, are small and medium enterprises or SMEs. So only 1%, you can see from the leftmost bar graphs, only 1% are not SMEs. But this 1%, they employ 29% of the 3.4 million workers, and they generate more than half of value added. So value added, you can think of that as GDP. So obviously, enterprises are very different. They are not uniform, and I hope they're not boring. Next slide, please. And it's also not a static picture, but a dynamic one. So enterprises are born, and this graph is taken from a 2019 study, and it shows the number of companies formed between 2014 and 2019 by sectors such as manufacturing sector or retail trade sector. And you can see that there are around 30,000 companies formed on average each year, but it fluctuates from year to year due to economic conditions. Next slide, please. There is birth and there is death, so this graph is taken from the same study, and it shows the number of businesses that ceased, that basically died over the same period. And by the way, so you see the interesting bump in 2016. So that was in part due to the exit of private car hire drivers following an initial surge in business registrations. So my point, the summary of these slides is to tell you that this churn, this entry and exit of enterprises is an inherent part of the enterprise landscape, and in fact, a healthy feature of market economies. Next slide, please. So to make this point more concrete, we can examine how such enterprise dynamics affect economic outcomes, such as productivity or employment. So let's start with productivity. And here we have this 2016 study, and what was done was they decomposed productivity growth in the manufacturing sector into three components represented by the stacked bars. So the within component, so this measures the contribution of productivity improvements from continuing firms. So firms that continue ongoing concerns. So that's called within firms. The second component is the reallocation effect, which measures the contribution of relative employment shifts between firms with either different productivity levels or different productivity growth rates. So reallocation contributes positively when firms with higher productivity levels or faster productivity growth rates gain employment shares. And the third component is called this firm churn effect. And this measures the contribution of the entry and exit of firms. So this firm churn effect is positive when firms entering a sector are more productive than the firms exiting. So the key point from this, so the key point from this exercise is that the dynamism from reallocation and firm churn effects became more significant contributors to productivity after the global financial crisis. These two components accounted for 48%, nearly half of manufacturing productivity growth between 2009 and 2013. So it's important to have this dynamism in the enterprise landscape. Next slide, please. And apart from productivity, we could also look at job creation or employment creation. So this is a 2018 study, and it took a different perspective, and it asks how enterprises of different age groups generated employment growth. So there are young firms, right, and there are young at heart firms or older firms. So the first point you see from the diamonds that are plotted on the graph is that the contribution to employment growth is larger from young firms as compared to older firms. In fact, if you see the diamond on the right, it's more or less zero for older firms because they didn't contribute to employment growth. The second point you can see from the graph is that for young firms, it is the entry of new firms that accounted for a significant portion of their contribution, which you can see from the brown stacked bar on the left. So new firms are the youngest of young firms, basically the newborns, and they are an important driver of a dynamic enterprise landscape. Next slide. So let me summarize that section. So a dynamic enterprise landscape is a healthy feature of Singapore's economy. And this dynamism contributes positively to important outcomes such as productivity growth and job creation. So a natural question you may ask is, what role does the government play? So in this section, I will describe the impact of 3 examples of government schemes, grants, loans, and digital solutions. So obviously, this is by no means exhaustive. So the point rather is to illustrate government's role by giving you some examples that we have studied. Next slide, please. So my first example describes the impact from this grant scheme called, it was an old scheme, but it was called the Capability Development Grant, or CDG, that is managed by Enterprise Singapore, which is a statutory board. So the CDG aimed to help SMEs build internal capabilities across areas ranging from productivity improvement and human capital development to service excellence. A study published in 2021 examined the effects of the CDG on firm-level outcomes such as revenue and total exports. So this graph that you see is reproduced from that study and shows that an additional CDG grant resulted in a 3.1% increase in the firm's revenue, as you can see from the bar on the left, and a 2.5% increase in its total exports, as seen in the right-hand side bar. I won't go through the methodological details here, and some of you may be interested, but let me say something brief about this. In this and many studies we have undertaken to evaluate the impact of programs or policies, we are obviously cognizant of potential confounding effects of other factors at play. So as economists, one concern we always have when we look at raw data is selection bias, where the participants of a given scheme are different from the non-participants. Of course, as we know, from also the COVID experience and how we knew whether vaccines were effective, for example, right? We know that the gold standard for evidence is to conduct randomized controlled trials or clinical trials to uncover the causal effects of policy. However, in practice, in government, we often don't have the luxury of experimenting or waiting for the perfect natural experiment. So we cannot simply look under the lamppost, as the saying goes. Instead, we need to know whether a policy has worked or not, regardless of the circumstance. So as a practical matter, we have employed the full range of methods at our disposal. The graph here and the study here used fixed effects regressions, but we've used instrumental variables, difference in differences, matching methods, regression, discontinuity, basically anything that is necessary. So I'm proud to say that when we talk about economics in practice and evidence-based policy making, we have employed many tools in the Economist toolkit. So that was just by way of talking about methodology briefly, but let me move to my next example. Next slide, please. So this second example is about a micro loan scheme. So it's also administered by Enterprise Singapore. And the micro loan scheme is a broad-based scheme. It provides working capital financing for micro enterprises, which are defined to have not more than $1 million in company annual sales turnover, or not more than 10 employees under the company. So that's a micro enterprise. And this graph from a 2018 study, it shows that the revenue impact per dollar of microloan was $2.60 to $2.91 to 2 years after receiving the loan. So it was a positive impact, and the researchers attributed these positive results to the help that the ESG loan schemes provided to firms in terms of meeting their working capital needs, which in turn helped enable the firms to expand their sales. So next slide, please. So my final example is on digital adoption. So as we have seen and maybe personally experienced through COVID, through the past 2 years, digital solutions are critical for many businesses. And the iSprint scheme was a financial assistance scheme administered by IMDA that helped local SMEs to defray the cost of automating their business functions through information technology. So off-the-shelf solutions and green lane solutions were packaged solutions for which the iSprint scheme, defrayed up to 70% of the qualifying project cost. So these results were taken from a 2016 study on the impact of these off-the-shelf and green lane solutions under the iSprint scheme on firm level revenues. And it shows that firms' revenue rose by 4.6% and 1.9% for off-the-shelf and green lane solutions, respectively. So just to summarize this section, essentially, I've given you examples of at least some of the schemes that we've studied, that the public sector economists have studied, in order to understand whether a given scheme has worked or not, was effective or not. Next slide, please. And in this last section, somewhat as a postscript, I want to touch on some of the early research we have done on the COVID-19 support measures, which were kind of rolled out under slightly different circumstances. Next slide, please. As you know, COVID led to the worst recession since independence. So it was in fact worse than the global or Asian financial crisis. Next slide, please. And there were various support measures in place to support both households and businesses. And between MTI and the Ministry of Trade and Industry, where I work, and Ministry of Finance, we've published a few studies that examine the effectiveness of these schemes, at least some early evidence of that. But today I want to briefly describe the findings from one such study published earlier this year in February that examined the impact of the Job Support Scheme, or JSS. So what's JSS? It provided wage subsidies to employers to help them retain local employees. And there were 3 tiers of support based on the severity of the COVID-19 impact on those sectors. So there were tier 1 sectors, and this comprised aviation, aerospace, tourism sectors, which were the most badly affected due to global travel restrictions. And then there were tier 2 sectors. So this comprised the food services, basically F&B, retail trade, arts and entertainment, land transport. And these sectors were adversely affected by things like safe management measures, weakened consumer sentiments and demand. And this tier 2 received the next highest level of support. So tier 1 received the most, and then tier 2 the next level. And then all other sectors were classified as tier 3. Interestingly, tier 3, this tier of sectors accounted for the largest share of the economy and local employment. Hence, you can see, starting from the leftmost graph on this slide, tier 3 sectors, in fact, received the largest share of JSS payout compared to the other tiers, simply because there were more, the sectors in tier 3 were a larger share of economy. But however, on a per firm basis and a per local employee basis, as you can see from the second and third charts from the left, tier 1 firms received the highest JSS payout per firm and per local employee in those firms, which is exactly as a policy had intended. So what was the impact of JSS? So this 2021 study found that the JSS was effective in helping local workers. Specifically, if you look at the rightmost graph, the researchers found that every 10 percentage point increase in the effective JSS wage subsidy led to a 0.44 or 0.13 net increase in local jobs saved per firm per month for the tier 1 and tier 2 sectors respectively. I won't go into details. You can read this study on how this treatment variable of effective JSS wage subsidy was defined, but essentially each tier had a different wage subsidy, 50% or 75% up to a certain wage ceiling. But the point is that jobs were saved. Obviously, as you saw from the previous graph on the previous slide, that this was insufficient to stave off the recession completely, but things could have been worse. And to give you a sense of this, the study also estimated that in total, about 165,000 local jobs were preserved. So that was at the aggregate level between March and December 2020. So let me conclude. Next slide, please. Over the years, I think public sector economists have conducted a lot of research on enterprises in Singapore. You had several, I gave you examples of several studies that looked at the dynamic process of enterprise formation and cessation. I also gave you examples of studies that evaluated the effectiveness of specific government schemes. And more recently, COVID-19 taught us that government support can be crucial in times of crisis. But for policies to be effective through good times and bad, I think they must be informed by high quality research that supports evidence-based policy making in Singapore for enterprises specifically, but I think more generally. So thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions later.
All right, thank you, Andy. Thank you for sharing and the evaluations of the effectiveness of government policies in stimulating the growth of enterprises, supporting them in Singapore. Right. So a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A section. Next up, we have Dr. Jungho Lee. His topic will be slightly a more micro perspective of small and medium, of startup firms, right? And a quick introduction, Dr. Jungho Lee is an assistant professor of economics at the Singapore Management University. His research interests includes labor economics, entrepreneurship, and industrial organization. His research aims to understand the various factors that affect worker and firm productivity. And he will be presenting on the topic of startup firms and workplace environment, evidence from the advertised corporate culture. Now I pass the time over to Jungho.
Thank you very much. So let me first share my screen. Could you see the slide?
It is not maximized on my side.
Oh, let me see. Okay. What about now?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Let me just. Okay. Is it working?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Thank you very much for Shane for organizing this speaker series, and thank you for inviting me as a speaker. I'm Jungho Lee, an assistant professor at the School of Economics, Singapore Management University. So today, I'm going to present my recent work about startup companies in Singapore and discuss about the role of workplace environment. The title of this paper is Startup Companies, Startup Firms and Workplace Environment, Evidence from Advertised to Corporate Culture. So let me first explain the motivation of this work. So a distinctive workplace environment, often called corporate culture, emerged among startup companies. So workplace environment can be defined in various ways. And I'm going to be more specific about what I mean by workplace environment in my paper. But if you think about two situations where you're working at a tech companies in Silicon Valley, and the other case where you're working in a traditional company, say bank, with some hierarchy culture, you can see some difference in terms of workplace environment. So my question in this project is why firms advocate certain types of workplace environments. So I'm gonna answer to this question using the Singaporean data, which I'm gonna explain in a minute. So specifically, I'm interested in three questions. How does workplace environment differ across startup firms? And why did a particular type of workplace environment emerge among startup firms? And finally, what is the role of workplace environment on startup formation, firm creation? Maybe the challenge in answering these questions is to measure each firm's workplace environment. So in this project, what I'm going to do is the following. So I'm going to use very rich text information from an online job board based in Singapore and characterize their workplace environment using each firm's advertised corporate culture. And then I'm going to analyze the data and then document new facts about firms' advertised corporate culture. And finally, I'm going to develop a simple theoretical framework by which we can think about these observable empirical findings. To give you a brief overview of my result, I'm going to show you there exists a popular corporate culture among employees, especially young employees, some of you guys. And there may be several reasons why firms advocating this popular culture, maybe productivity enhancement or like cost reduction. And I'm going to show that the main reason why firms are advocating this popular corporate culture may be the cost reduction. They want to reduce especially labor cost. And finally, I'm going to also demonstrate that if startup firms are financially constrained, and those firms are more likely to provide the popular corporate culture. And finally, the option of providing this employee favorable workplace environment can actually increase firm creation. So let me first explain how I characterize each firm's workplace environment. So before explaining the job posting website that I'm gonna use, let me first briefly explain about the background of this industry. So basically, these websites are targeting the startup companies in Southeast Asia. And as some of you might know, over the last 7 or 5 or 7 years, there's a boom in startup companies in Southeast Asia, especially driven by large expansion of mobile internet in this region. So this website, established in 2016, is specifically targeted to startup companies in Southeast Asia, especially in Singapore and Indonesia. One unique feature of this website is that this website actually asks all posting firms to write about their corporate culture. Okay. And I asked some of the personnel of website why you created this function, and their answer was that firm itself, the firm creating this website itself is a startup firm, and they believe communicating their corporate culture is really important. And that's the reason why they actually created this separate section and allow each firm to explain their corporate culture. So I'm going to analyze all the jobs located in Singapore between 2016 and 2018. And in addition to this information about each firm's advertised corporate culture, I have full description of job postings. And also, I know where each job applicants applied to their jobs. And on top of that, for given job postings, I know for say 15 job candidates applied, and among them who were invited for an interview. So I'm going to use all this information for this project. So to give you a little bit of information about this labor market, you can think about this labor market is very specialized labor market in Singapore, especially high-tech industry. As you can see, most of these firms posting jobs are categorized as fintech, professional service, software, ad tech, or e-commerce. You can consider this as a startup companies in high-tech industry, very specialized market. And also labor supply is also specialized in a way that they're all young workers. Almost all applicants got college degree, and their years after graduation is on average 4, means that they're most likely less than 30 years old and finding a job in this tech industry in Singapore or Indonesia. So next task is how can we actually characterize each firm's advertised corporate culture. The first thing that I did is I read all this description by myself. One thing that I realized is that many of those firms are advertising their culture as something that is attractive to especially young workers. For example, the most frequently used adjective in describing their culture is fun. So for example, our culture is fun and we are passionate and etc. Okay. And of course, I need to characterize fun. This description in a more formal way. So I'm going to do the following procedures. So consider this large set of X as the collection of words, okay, used for describing any firm's corporate culture. So if any firm in this data set you ever used, say, fun, then that word will be included in this set X. And then I'm going to create a dummy variable of I for each word that takes value 1 if a certain firm use this particular word, otherwise 0. Then each firm's description of their culture can be characterized as collection of this large dummy variable, so that I can actually identify what they are writing. And then I'm going to exploit the following idea to kind of categorize or characterize each firm's corporate culture. My idea is the following. If two firms have a similar culture, then their usage of words in describing their culture will be similar as well. In other words, there will be some sort of clusters among those representation of their culture, this collection of these dummy variables. So to implement this idea, I conduct simple K-mean cluster analysis. I'm not going to explain in detail about the procedures, but after using these ideas and applying this simple cluster analysis, I'm going to get this result. So this is my categorization of firms' corporate culture. So among many firms' description, most firms can be categorized within 3 clusters. And let me explain about this each cluster, especially this first cluster. Many of those firms categorized as a first cluster explain their culture as something for customers or products or market. For example, many of them explain our culture is to serve our customers. That's our priority. Our culture is supporting for our vision. I mean, our mission for customers. Or some other companies may say that our goal is to produce world best product. Okay? And our focus is for doing that, and etc. On the other hand, firms categorized as the cluster 2 and cluster 3 are rather emphasizing employees and their well-being. For example, those firms are advertising their culture as innovative, passionate, and collaborative, and open, and etc. And cluster 3 as well, they're emphasizing something which is popular among employees, like fun or like love. But subtle difference between cluster 2 and cluster 3 is that these firms categorized within this cluster 3 often emphasize learning opportunities. So you're gonna have more opportunity to learn if you wanna work with us, and etc. Okay? And this text information is quite rich information. Therefore, we can use another methodology, which is called LDA analysis. But bottom line, even with using different methodology, I'm gonna get same result, same set of firms categorized as cluster 1 and 2 and 3. So overall, my conclusion is that characterization of advertised corporate culture, which text information generate very consistent result regardless of my usage of particular methodology, which suggests it is indeed the result of variation across firm in describing their culture in a particular way. As a next step, I'm going to look at whether this corporate culture matters for applicants, especially young applicants. Before explaining my main result, let me briefly explain about this overall picture of job postings. As I mentioned before, all of these workers, almost all of these workers are young workers. Therefore, the median salary is not that high, between $3,000 to $5,000 per month in Singapore dollars. And on average, each job posting attract 15 applicants. Okay. With that in mind, let me first present my first result. You can focus on this second column. So here's unit of observation is job posting, each job posting. And then Y variable is number of applications that each job posting received. And X variable is each job posting's characteristics. They're posted wages, some other characteristics of jobs, and some firm characteristics. The robust finding is that controlling for other factors that might affect this number of applications, firms advertising their culture as cluster 2 or cluster 3 attract significantly more applicants. Remember that average application is 15, and then those firms advertising cluster 2 and cluster 3 attract 3 or 4 more applications significantly. So from now on, I'm gonna group this cluster 2 and cluster 3 as one group because they actually are similar in terms of advertising their culture as some employee-based culture, and their effect on application is quite similar, and I'm going to group them together and I'm going to call them as employee-oriented culture. Next, I look at whether those firms, some firms advocating employee-oriented culture, or like the other firms, not necessarily so, whether they are looking for different types of applicants. And short answer to this question is no. In this regression, I show that many other characteristics of applicants is not predicting this acceptance rate. You remember that for each applications, I know, say, 15 applicants, and among them who were invited for an interview. So I can see what type of applicant characteristics can actually predict these interview invitations. And robust finding is that regardless of their cultures, their advertised cultures, the firms are more likely to invite a candidate who were invited by the other companies. Okay, so in other words, regardless of whatever regardless of type of culture that you advertise, you are looking for a kind of same candidate that the other firms are looking for. So to summarize, types of workers that these firms are looking for are kind of similar, regardless of their advertised culture. That's another finding in terms of firm side. Also, I found that those firms advertising this employee-oriented culture pay significantly less salary. Remember that this monthly salary, especially median salary is about 3,000 and 3,005. And then compared to job postings and other things being equal, if one firm's advertising their culture as something that is favorable to employees, employee-oriented culture, those firms are more likely to pay less, about $300 to $400, a significant 10 to 15% less salary than the other firms who are not advocating employee-oriented culture. Finally, then what type of firms are providing or advocating such a culture, popular culture or employee-oriented culture? And my robust finding is that venture funding. Not many firm characteristics are available, but I have firm size and whether a certain firm have venture funding or not, and also detailed industry categorizations. I realize if a firms have venture fundings, and those firms are significantly less likely to provide or advertise employee-oriented culture, okay, or popular culture. And this fact is still true even though we are looking at specific industry, even though we control this industry fixed effect. So to summarize my empirical findings so far, first, number of application is higher and wage is lower for employee-oriented culture, which might suggest at least some applicants among young workers prefer those employee-oriented culture, let's say fun culture. And also, firms' invitation decisions are similar, regardless of their advertised corporate culture, which suggests firms' preference regarding employees or whom they are looking for are quite similar, independent of their advertised corporate culture. Finally, firms having venture funding are less likely to provide this employee-oriented culture, which might suggest high productivity firms. Remember that only those high productivity firms will get venture funding, or venture funding itself actually says that they have enough funding. So high productivity firms or like firms with enough funding are less likely to provide this employee-oriented culture. So to think about these empirical findings in a more unified way, I'm going to present a very simple firm creation model. And let me briefly explain about the model and model implication, and let me conclude. So consider an individual or business owners who are characterized by theta, which is the quality of business idea, and A is individual wealth. And then these firms want to meet an employee to generate or like commercialize their business ideas. And first stage, they have to choose workplace environment, whether normal culture or fun culture. And the second stage, they have to invest capital. And in terms of revenues, normal culture generate according to this particular production function, theta k over alpha. But if these firms want to provide fun culture, their productivity and therefore revenue may be different depending on this factor mu. Okay, and also I'm going to assume, following the literature, that we're going to assume that some startup firms, especially those with limited wealth, will be financially constrained. Means that they cannot invest as much as they want, and their investment will be limited depending on their available wealth. So in this framework, firms' decision to provide this employee-oriented culture or fun culture is affected by two factors. First, by providing fun culture, the wage is going to be different. And second, as I mentioned before, their revenue will be different depending on their factor, mu factor. Okay, and firms will provide this fun culture or employee-oriented culture as long as the profit of doing that is greater than the other option. And finally, I'm going to assume that firms will start the business only if their profit is going to be positive. And from this very simple framework, I can draw three conclusions. First, if we observe in the data, wage for fun culture is less than wage for normal culture, then it must be the case that mu is less than 1. What is the mu? Mu is factor that is additional factor for productivity. So mu is less than 1 means that their productivity is going to be reduced. The revenue will be reduced. Okay, so by providing fun culture, they're going to get some, they're going to save labor cost because wage is going to be lower, but their revenue is going to be reduced, or like productivity is going to be reduced. As a like realistic example, as a farm owners, you want your workers work as much as possible, as hard as possible. But by claiming that you provide employee-oriented culture, you may not be able to force your workers, you know, as hard or as much as you want, and that may actually reduce your productivity or your revenues. Okay, that's kind of like idea of this proposition 1. And overall, labor cost saving is the main reason to provide fun culture to be consistent with the data. And second proposition is that if wage for fun culture is lower than the wage for normal culture, then the proportion of startup firms provide fun culture increases as lambda increases. What is lambda? Let me go back. So lambda actually captures the extent of financial constraint. As lambda goes down, the available information with your given wealth A is going to be reduced. Therefore, you're more likely to be financially constrained. So what does it mean? It means that tendency of providing fun culture is higher for financially constrained startup firms. Okay. Finally, in terms of fund creations. So as long as, again, the wage for fund culture is lower than wage for normal culture, these marginal entrepreneurs, which is firms whose profit is zero when there's no option of providing fund culture, will start the business by providing fund culture. So here, you are, especially if you're financial constrained and you're on the borderline whether you have to start business or not to start the business. And if you have an option of providing this fund culture, you can actually easily start the business by providing or by advertising or advocating this employee-oriented culture. So the idea is that by doing that, even though you're currently financially constrained, you can save some wage cost, thereby you can relatively easily start the business. So here, what's going on for firm's point of view is that you're selling this type of fun workplace environment in exchange for a little bit of reduction of your revenues. If there's some out there workers who prefer this type of fun culture, especially among young workers, okay? So to conclude, in this project, I used the startup firms data, especially based in Singapore, and investigated an issue of this workplace environment, and then the role of this workplace environment on especially firm creations. So in doing so, I first characterized different firms' workplace environment using advertised corporate culture, and I document several facts related to advertised corporate culture. And my conclusion is that cost reduction is the reason why we see so many, relatively many startup firms advertising, very favorable workplace environment toward, especially for young workers. And the overall, this finding actually explains this corporate culture or distinctive workplace environment can be influenced by labor market condition, which is characterized by young workers who are favorable to certain type of workplace environment, fun workplace environment. And also their firm's cost saving motive, especially for those who are financially constrained. And these labor market conditions and their financial condition can actually influence the startup firm's workplace environment or corporate culture. I think this is it for my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jungho. I think this is a very, very interesting study, at least to myself, right? And probably we can draw some intuition also and relate to our own workplace culture, our own wages, our own productivity. But of course, this study is constrained to startup firms, right? But of course, we can try to see whether it applies also to our workplace. I also found the model to be quite elegant that you proposed to explain your empirical findings. All right, let's give Jungho a breather first. We have a number of questions that come in. I think most of them are still addressed to Andy. And if you have any questions for Jungho, please keep them coming in. So let's try to address some of these questions that have come in. All right, some of them are in the Q&A and some in the chat as well. So I believe that the audience will be able to see the questions that are in the Q&A, right? Okay, so the first question, I think with regards to the government grants, why did the measure grants stop? Andy, would you have any comments on?
Sure, Shane, but I'm not sure what the question means.
Right. I'm also trying to figure this out. I was hoping that you were able to make sense, but we can put that aside. And if you still want to elaborate on a question, please feel free. Right, then we can move on to the second question, which is the issue of compliance. That business managers think that compliance is a showstopper, and the cost of compliance is also expensive for firms. So the key question is, what are the initiatives to keep compliance costs low, and what are the monitoring costs for government?
Okay. I can share my thoughts on this, but I just, I should clarify that my job here today is not to necessarily talk about policy or either in terms of future policy or policy position. It's more to talk about the economics and some of the evaluations we've done. But I mean, on this question of compliance cost, I think we do and here I'm speaking as, I guess, a representative of MTI. We do recognize that compliance cost and it is one of the many cost issues facing businesses. So I think Singapore in general is known for being a pro-business environment. So I can only give you a broad answer without knowing the specifics of the compliance costs you're referring to. But the broad answer is yes, we are aware. And of course, to economists, our question, maybe I wouldn't say starting point, but generally our lens to think about issues is whether there's market failure. And, to the extent that something needs to be done, there is a market failure, then maybe a compliance or certain regulation is necessary. But of course, if it is costs beyond what is sensible, then that obviously would affect competitiveness, which is a bad thing, right? So it's unnecessary compliance costs. So again, that's a broad reply without knowing the specific of the compliance or costs we are talking about. It's very hard to be more specific. But more importantly, I think I'm not here to comment on specific policies per se, but to talk about the economics and around some of the schemes.
Right. Thank you. I think the next question would be the one that would be more interesting, which is in the evaluation of policies, do you apply causal machine learning models, and do they provide additional values compared to our traditional econometrics models?
Yeah, thank you, Lin Jie, for this question. So the answer in brief is yes, we have explored these. I would say that it's still very exploratory. I think these methods are very new. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we do use the full range of tools in the toolkit that's available, but it does also depend on the policy question. So to the extent that we do need to use some of these methods, we will. But if truth be told, I think because these methods are so new, I don't think we have used it pervasively yet. Let me elaborate a little bit more about methodology, building on my earlier answer. I think some of the things I talked about earlier were about causal inference, and some of you may be familiar about these methods. And I think, most recently, the most recent Nobel Prizes in economics were given to, Card, Angrist, and Imbens for some of these methods, right? So this, and these methods we apply in government as public sector economists to answer questions about what was the effect of something. So that's one class of methods we use for one class of questions we have. Then obviously, very, I guess you would say more traditional methods for the kind of questions that are about prediction as well. So the second class of questions that we often face in public sector, and maybe in particular for the team I lead in terms of macroeconomic forecasting, are those prediction questions where you basically want to forecast something. It's not necessarily about knowing the causal effects, right? It's about predicting GDP next year or next quarter. So I think, when you put these two questions together and you have causal machine learning models, as you described it, which tries to improve on the traditional causal methods by using what we know and what we've learned from machine learning methods. I think that's very interesting, and there are a lot of opportunities for us there. But because it's so new, I don't think we've used it pervasively yet. Thanks.
Well, I think that in the academia, this is the same case as well. We are exploring, but it is still quite new. And But there has been a lot of attention, right? I mean, I just attended a talk by Asst who also talked about machine learning to identify causal relationships. I don't know whether Jungho, you have any experience in applying machine learning methods?
I understand there's some attempt to connect this machine learning technology to this causal inference, but I agree with Andy in a way that, I mean, in a sense that mostly the machine learning maybe at the current stage is helpful for predicting, like, using this current information to predict the future outcomes. But in economics, I don't think it's widely, as of now, used for causal inferencing. That's all I know. But there's, I mean, what I can tell is that there's some attempt to, connect these two. So we're gonna see in the future that, this causal inference may be enhanced by some of this machine learning technology or like techniques. But most of causal inference in economics paper right now, I think is based on the traditional the methodology. That's what I can tell.
Right. I mean, if we have any machine learning experts in the audience, feel free to enlighten us, right? All right. Maybe we have a question for Dr. Lee. Right. It is a very interesting paper that you have presented. Could I ask how you decide on the number of clusters topic in K-means and LDA? Since one of the biggest challenges in unsupervised machine learning is to decide on the number of clusters. So you have 3 clusters.
Very good questions. First of all, I'm not the expert on this methodology, LDA methodology. I'm just using the existing methodology. So it's right that determining the number of clusters is a kind of like, it's a tricky issue. So I actually followed some other economists have done. So what I did is that I actually start from the minimum clusters from 2, and then run the conduct the analysis, and then see the result, and then whether I can see distinctive feature within these 2 clusters. And if not, I increase the number of clusters from 2 to 3 and see the result, whether I can see meaningful difference across clusters, and from 3 to 4 and so on. And my goal was to find the minimum clusters that can actually distinctly show some characteristics across clusters. At the same time, the number is not that high. So that number was 3. So it's actually a subjective number. So the reason why I choose 3 is the minimum. That is the minimum number of clusters that I can see some meaningful difference across clusters. Okay, and of course, I did some robustness checks by using 4 clusters and 5 clusters and 6 clusters, and the result is going to be consistent. So that's another way of addressing this type of issues, number of clusters. And LDA is the same. The reason why I choose 3 cores is because I chose the 3 clusters in cluster analysis. Again, but I conducted several the other number of clusters and then see whether the result is robust. Indeed robust. Therefore, I'm kind of comfortable using 3, and that's the reason why I chose 3 as the number of clusters. Very good questions, but I don't have the answer to optimal number of clusters. But this is the way I chose the number of clusters.
Right. Continuing from that, we have a slightly more intuitive question at the very end, which is, why does fun culture and productivity seems to be inversely proportionate to each other?
So am I supposed to answer right?
Sorry?
So this is my question to me. Is this?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. So so what I did is that there's some 2 stories. This fun culture may enhance productivity. So some of those, proponent of adopting this culture is to argue that it creates some productivity or increased productivity of workers. But my empirical finding is actually, if that is the case, everyone actually are willing to provide this fun culture. So for example, like, the key idea is that if as a firm owners, you understand that by providing fun culture, you're gonna hire same workers with lower cost. At the same time, you believe that your productivity is gonna be higher. Then what is gonna happen in equilibrium is that every firms will provide fun culture. Therefore, we may not be able to observe this wage differential, that fun culture having lower salary than normal culture in equilibrium. Therefore, to rationalize this empirical finding in equilibrium, it must be the case that there's some cost involved with providing fun culture. And in my model, through the lens of my model, it comes in the revenue side, so that productivity is going to be lower. So that's our rationalization. So I'm not estimating the reduction of fun culture in productivity or revenue by randomized control, but it just through the lens of my model, it is the only option that rationalize empirical findings. So yeah, that's the reason why I argue that it is mostly cost reduction motive rather than productivity enhancement motive.
Thank you. Well, I share the same sentiments actually. I mean, the question is like, really, can your findings be generalized to the Silicon Valley, in which all the, I mean, the top firms in Silicon Valley promotes a fun-loving culture. They say that it's conducive for innovations, and they do command a high wage, right? People who work in this really aggressive startups, and also many of these are funded by venture capitalists. And I do notice that while your model is overall is very robust, but when it came to the part on venture funding, the goodness of it is actually a bit lower, if I'm not wrong. So do you think that this?
The answer to that question is I don't know, because this opportunity of characterizing this culture is unique within Singapore. I think, as far as I understand, among world, I don't see any data available to characterize Silicon Valley's startup corporate culture. So, and then I understand Google actually emphasize some employee-oriented culture. So maybe that example is not suitable for my theoretical framework. And moreover, I cannot say that it can be kind of like generalized into other countries, especially in Silicon Valley. But what I can say is that within Singapore, within this region, this type of culture can be used for reducing the labor cost, especially among startup firms. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Jungho. I think this is good advice for all the aspiring entrepreneurs, right? Good insights. All right, maybe coming back to some of the policy questions. We have a question on the CDG in specific. Okay, CDG grants seems to be helpful. Wanted to know if there are any studies to see if this grant recipient is a new organization or an existing one. Is there any certain industries or firm effects that benefited the most? One other question is how value added is composited in TFP. So that is a bit the second question. Yes, maybe Andy would like to comment on the first question first.
Sure, thanks, Shane. As I mentioned earlier, the CDG grant was an old scheme. So now it has been kind of folded into a new grant scheme called the Enterprise Development Grant. But more directly to the question whether we have examined whether certain industries or firms benefit the most, the answer is no. And I think it is related to the answer to the first part, which is whether it's a new organization or an existing one. So I think the reason is the reason that we have not looked at this, and I can't give you detailed answer is because these grants are the eligibility is quite broad. So I think it is just SMEs. There's no real ownership criteria, if I recall. So essentially, it is open to any SME that applies. So I don't think there is any policy reason to investigate if the impact is different. And if it is, it's hard to see what to make of that lah. For some of the other policies, we do try to look at whether there are differences. And then the more practical question is whether we have enough firms to examine. For some of the more targeted schemes, you'll find that once you start distinguishing between different sectors or different firm sizes, there are very few firms, and obviously our econometric methods break down once you have too small a sample. So I think that is roughly the answer for the first part. I think the second question is about is it about the difference between value added and TFP?
Yeah.
So I think TFP is a concept that economists are quite familiar with. And there is this joke, right, among economists that it's basically a residual term. Once you've accounted for all the factors that you can observe, then whatever output that is produced that cannot be explained by whatever you observe, let's just call it TFP. So TFP is basically a measure of our ignorance of productivity and what drives productivity. Value added, on the other hand, is a bit more observable. I think it's not necessarily an economics concept. It is, in fact, a statistical concept, and statisticians do a great job of measuring value add. And for example, our national accounts, right? When you think about concepts like GDP, right, you can essentially think of that as the summation of value added across the firms, across the industries. And when you look at a particular firm and you ask what is the value added of this firm, you are essentially asking how much does it pay its workers and its owners, right, in terms of the returns to labor and the returns to capital. Because whatever output it produced that did not go into paying for all the other upstream suppliers or the raw materials must be paid to the workers that the business employed, and whatever is left, the owners, the capital owners will receive. So that is the value added of the firm. So it's a bit different from TFP, which, as I mentioned earlier, was about productivity.
Yeah, I think that very clearly addresses the question. All right, we don't have much time yet left, but we do have a couple more questions, and we want to take this opportunity. Maybe there is a question on what kind of comparative advantage Singapore would have to remain lucrative for export. I think this is a policy position question, and perhaps we can, I don't know whether it's a ministerial level question, but perhaps we can,
yeah.
Do you want to address it?
No, I could just say something about that, and maybe it's a non-reply, but there is a chapter in that book that Min Leong mentioned, our 20th anniversary book, that looks at trade and investments. It doesn't quite go into what kind of comparative advantages that Singapore in future would need, which as Shane pointed out, it's a broader policy discussion lah. But at least if you look at that chapter, I can't remember, chapter 3 in the book, it does look at the data and our historical record, and it tells you where did our exports go, where did our investments go, and what drove those historical performances lah. So if you are interested in this area of our trade and our investments, I do urge you again to look at that book, which also has many other things to say.
Okay, thank you. I also want to address this question, which is the second question by Jonathan, which I believe that many of the audience have posted prior to joining the session, which is what are the ways in which students interested in applied economics and public policy can gain exposure to this type of work in university, right, during university, aside from the avenues that you have introduced, such as internships. How do, I mean, as young economics students, what kind of exposure should we seek? Ming Leong, would you have any comments on this?
Yeah, definitely. So maybe I would encourage students in university to go to try out final year projects, because for the students who come to us, you get a chance to get your hands dirty, get your chance to work on data, to run econometric specifications, or even machine learning, data science related techniques. You get your chance to get your hands dirty. It's a very strong plus, and then that will give you exposure into the type of work like in applied economics. Another thing that is quite useful as a student is to look at studies and that are interesting, that you are interested in, and think about how to replicate them. Because many of the studies in overseas contexts, right, they do describe the methodology, they describe the data. Think of it in Singapore's context. Can we replicate that study in Singapore's context? And just think about replicating it using public data that's available from the Department of Statistics or other sources. And by getting your hands dirty, this is a good way for you to learn on your own, even if you're not taking up explicitly ES internship. Yeah.
As a student not so long ago, maybe I will also suggest take up research assistantship positions, help your professors conduct research. You have proper guidance, you have access to data, right? And another recommendation is to come for more of such sessions and look at some of the research that's being done, right? It's not every day that we get to see all this delivered in a intelligible manner. All right, we don't have much time. Thank you, Bryce, for your comments on machine learning. Right, we do have a machine learning expert in the audience, right? Yeah. All right. So I just want to quickly take this opportunity to wrap up the session. All right. And we do have some other sessions that are planned. And in the next session that is scheduled to be sometime in May, we will be touching on some of the research and in land transport in Singapore. All right, for that, we have Dr. Leong Wai Yen, the Chief Transport Economist from the Land Transport Authority. We also have another familiar name, which is Associate Professor Walter Teixeira, my colleague, right, who is a former NMP. Right, he will also be joining us as the speaker for this session. So if you're interested, please look out for our flyer and EDM and register for the session. Right, subsequent sessions that we have in mind, which are not confirmed yet, includes topics on healthcare, productivity and innovation, environment, income inequality, and more. Right, if you have any suggestions for topics that you think is interesting, feel free also to write into our contact email at essyoungprofessionals@gmail.com, or you can choose to contact me directly at tstan@suss.edu.sg. Okay, you may also join the Economic Society of Singapore as a member. From the main website, you'll be able to navigate it to the membership page. Right, we also have an Instagram page that's just started out. Feel free to follow it. You will be able to get the updates here. Right, as I said, this session is recorded and we will be posting it and publicizing it after editing where necessary. Right, this will take some time, but we will be publicizing it on our Instagram, right? And also in the next session, okay? So do look out for that. Right, before I close off, any further comments from our speakers? I think this has been a very productive session. We have discussed, I have many more questions actually, but unfortunately, no time to ask. All right, maybe we can take the last question here that has not been addressed by Jonathan, which is this is a common question, right? That as researchers, we are not being exposed to actual industry experience. How would that impair our analysis, right? Any takers for this?
Yeah, I can share my thoughts, and I'm sure Ming Leong and Jungho also have their thoughts. I mean, I think it's a fair question. Well, you know, and I'm going to try to take it on bravely. I wonder if actually the business school professors should be here answering this, because you know, as their titles suggest, business school, right, should be about business. But more seriously, I think the first point is that economics is a lot more than about enterprises and businesses. I think today's session, and thanks again Shane and the ESS for helping to organize this. Today's session was on enterprises, but obviously, you know, as he pointed out, there's so many other sessions coming your way. So please do join us, and you'll see that, you know, economics is much more than just about businesses. You know, if you are old enough to know people like Stephen Levitt, right, he even looked at things like sumo wrestlers, right, and called them cheating. So that's very far from businesses. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say is that you know, there is a kind of distinction between being the thing you're studying and actually studying it. So to give you maybe a somewhat lighthearted example, and I'm told, right, that, you know, zoologists, they're not much like the animals that they study, right? but you know, my analogy is that on the one hand, maybe running businesses would be useful for economists, and some economists have done so, right? Keynes famously did pretty well in the stock market. But you know, there is also a sense that as scientists, you know, when economists are scientists, there is that separation between what we are studying and in this case businesses and being businessmen lah. And the third point that I want to make is that the converse, right? That actually running a business is also not just about economics. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than economics, right? Businesses, big and small, have all manners of people in it, be they lawyers, accountants, finance types. So, you know, running a business is not just about economics. And therefore, I think from both perspectives, from the economist perspective, as well as from the business perspective, we have things to learn from each other, but it may not be necessary to be one and the same. Yeah, so thanks again. And I had a great time today. It was a pity. I mean, I hope all of you listening are nice and warm at home somewhere. But it was a pity I couldn't see you and we couldn't interact as we would have before COVID. But thanks again for letting me speak.
Right. Okay, I think it's about time. Thank you all for joining us today. As a student not so long ago, I've always wondered about, you know, what policymakers, what are the economics applications in policy making, in evaluating policies, in research, in translating what you learn in the classroom to the real world. And I hope that today's session, you're able to glean some of these economic applications, learn some of the techniques and modelings, some of the key approaches that economists undertake. And I hope this inspires you to pursue your career and research interest in economics. Right? Thank you all. And we will conclude the session as of now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Special thanks to Andy and Jungho for joining us today. And of course, Ming Leong for providing an overview of the Economist service. Thank you.
Thank you very much.